This next question comes from Carbonate Locke, and he asks, what techniques, methods, or value sets have been lost or watered down because of the change towards sports and adaptation into modern culture? I.e., spear hand is no longer taught to the eyes, students are allowed to ask questions during class, no longer punishing or killing someone for violating rashiki. As a follow-up, are these changes for the better? Now there's a lot of stuff going on in this question, a lot of cultural implications, a lot of technical implications, but I'll try to encapsulate what I feel is going on and give some examples of how I see things changing. And I'd like to speak specifically from my style. So I am from Okinawa Kempo, which was founded by Shigeru Nakamura. And Nakamura's story is an interesting one and actually has many layers of what you're talking about right here. So in his early days, in fact in his earliest days, he learned from his father and his uncle, as well as Choki Matobu, the famous fighter. However, in his youth he was sent to Ichu Middle School. And at Ichu, the first ever karate experience in a school environment was set up. It was created by Itosu Anko at the behest of the Japanese emperor. Japanese imperialism was at a high level. So some of the best martial artists of the time, including Ken Tsuyabu, Higashiona, Anko himself, were around and teaching these classes. So you'd think that the students there had the highest level of everything, but that wasn't necessarily the case. In fact, a lot of the material was changed to better accommodate a group environment. For the first time, there were many students, better set up to create a physical fitness aspect, strong legs, strong body, ready for the Japanese army if need be, a group mindset as well, very nationalistic, as well as techniques that could be utilized quickly and easily and computed by a younger mind. So quickly and easily means you only have a year or so to teach a person. You can't use the old Okinawan method of decades in that environment. Furthermore, you have the young mind of youngsters, and they can't necessarily handle a spear hand penetrating the eye or activating a multiple Kyusho vital points as you do technique. So it had to be watered down in order to accommodate them. Now Nakamura himself would later go on to pursue deeper levels of study with Anko himself and with an individual named Kuniyoshi in Nago City, and he would create a little bit more of a complex and organic and deep aspect to his art. However, that watering down that began then continued through modern day and actually has become amplified more and more as martial arts spread and continue to diffuse. So in that way, I would say to you that it's bad because the original core concepts that made traditional martial arts great are being lost, and they're being lost rapidly. Now, it's not all bad. In fact, mindset has actually been developed and improved over time. Go back a few generations and jutsu, bujutsu, was more of a focus than budo, the way. And especially in Japan, the focus was on sheer technique and power in combat, rather than a very encompassing philosophical encapsulation of the entire art. Only after the Warring States period and the Meiji Restoration rolled around, when the samurai weren't quite as useful, did they begin their foolish studies, the art, the ikebana, things of that nature, the poetry. Now, of course, it existed before then, but it really came into its own at that point. So in that way, philosophy has just recently seen an increase in sophistication. Now, of course, in more of a modern era, a lot of sophistication has been lost because nobody wants to try to intermingle too many different Western and Eastern philosophies. Sometimes that can be bad for business, so a lot of schools will avoid that. In that way, it can be a bit of a loss as well. Now, one thing you mentioned was the killing or the punishing or killing for violating rashiki. And when you mention that, I believe you're probably referring to kirisute gomen. And that basically means the authorization to cut and leave. And that was something that the samurai had as a an ability during their time of power. So that's when you hear stories of a sloppy peasant coming by, nudging into the sword of a samurai, and in one deft motion the samurai cleaving the peasant in twain, wiping his blade and going on about his day. So it was a matter of respect for that samurai that you do not confront him. And some stories of that sort of harshness are indulged upon in the Japanese dojo as well. So the problem with that is a lot of those very aggrandized elements of Rishiki came out of the samurai ego rather than Bushido itself. And a lot of it came out of samurai lore as well. So certain amounts of that are exaggerated over time, and our imaginations are sort of captured by them. However, it's also important to remember that the samurai were not completely perfect beings. They had a tendency to abuse their power as often as they held up for good with it. So things like Kirisute Gomen were abused at times, and the fact that we do not have as much of that punishment anymore is a good thing. And in fact, a lot of the early dojos in the West were a result of military personnel. So military individuals sent to Okinawa, to China, to Japan, brought back that military mindset with them because it's what they were, raised upon. And in a lot of ways, it was excellent because it made these people strong and disciplined and focused. But in some ways, the civilians that they were getting ready to teach weren't prepared for that. And in fact, it may not have been a part of the original curriculum. It's important to remember that a lot of the Okinawans were not soldiers. Some were police, yes. Some were guards, yes. But some were also farmers and fishermen and normal people like you and I who simply needed the ability to defend themselves. So that hard punishment can be done in different ways. And in fact, a reduction of that, in my opinion, is probably a good thing. Now, one other thing you mentioned is the asking of questions. And so a lot of stories come about where a student has to train a particular kata for 3 years and never ask his sensei a word of inquiry regarding the kata. And in fact, this occurred both in Okinawa and in Japan, and as far as my research has shown, in China as well. And this is a cultural difference. It involves the Confucian hierarchy that is highly utilized in the East, as opposed to the Western essence of exploration, of individualism, and of finding out as much as you can. So, there are pros and cons to both methods. The Eastern method of not asking questions makes you focus both on what you're doing and really visualizing on what your teacher's doing. You must look at every aspect and absorb every aspect because there's no way for you to gain information otherwise. So in a lot of ways you can gain detailed sensibilities that you wouldn't have if you were busy thinking of questions and brainstorming. On the other hand, sometimes information simply cannot be translated unless it's communicated accurately. And in the West, that's done very well. So we see times through previous generations when we ask our instructors, for example, when my instructor Bruce Heilman would ask his instructor Odo Sakichi about things he learned from Nakamura Sensei, sometimes Odo Sensei didn't have a specific answer. He just said, oh, Nakamura Sensei do this, or Mariyoshi Sensei do this. In the West, we're much more inclined to ask questions, absorb, get a lot of details as we can. However, sometimes our minds think too much and we're not paying attention to what's going on in front of us. So in that way, I believe both aspects have positives, and if you can, you should probably integrate both as much as you can. So I know that that's not one definitive answer for you, but I think it's important to recognize the realistic pros and cons of both cultures in the ways that they can accent each other, as well as reaching back and keeping a hold of tradition, as well as recognizing which parts can be not changed, but utilized in a better fashion for both our culture and for the good of students in future generations.